In February 2020, I was invited to be a guest speaker on a television special for Oprah's book club. While on the show, I said something that had taken me a long time to claim. Now I realize that being a border crosser is my superpower. It took me years of writing and self-reflection to get to the place where I could see my immigrant journey, including my immigrant trauma, as my greatest source of strength. Before I wrote The Distance Between Us, I hadn't gotten to that place of discovery yet. I didn't know it, but I felt it, that I needed to write this book. After so many years of enduring discrimination and microaggressions in the United States, I had grown ashamed of my border crossing, my immigrant identity, and my Mexican roots. To hide this part of me and remain silent was an option, but it was one that in the end would have led to even more shame and trauma. So instead, I made a different choice. I decided to confront my past and reframe it. Writing my immigrant story was an act of rebellion. It was a way of pushing back against a society that forces its immigrants, especially immigrants of color, to hide or deny who they are. Writing my own story on my own terms was liberating, empowering. I didn't know that this act of self-empowerment would lead to others' empowerment too, but the emails and letters I have received from readers through the years, especially those from immigrants and children of immigrants, tell a different story. When readers tell me they see themselves reflected in the distance between us, I know that by finding the courage to tell my story, I've inspired others to celebrate theirs too. It makes me excited to observe that in the past decade, the literature written by the undocumented has grown. But as I expressed to Oprah, the opportunities to publish such stories are still limited, and immigrant writers continue to be underpublished, underrepresented, and underpaid. I also wrote The Distance Between Us as a call for change. I've grown tired of how our political leaders have failed the immigrant community again and again. I hope that writing about my experiences being separated from my parents, crossing the border, and coming of age in the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant would contribute to the conversation on immigration in a way that centered our humanity. Instead of statistics, I offered a deeply personal story of a young Mexican immigrant trying to find her place in the U.S. while striving to reach her full potential. While I was writing this book, the DREAM Act fell to pass again. People like me who came to this country as children were denied the opportunity to legalize their status and make a permanent home here. Then in 2012, 2 months before the publication of The Distance Between Us, Barack Obama, who was up for re-election, introduced DACA, a temporary 2-year program that offers relief from deportation and a work permit to dreamers at a hefty fee. But a 2-year program can never offer its recipients what comprehensive immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship could give: a chance to build a life, a future, on something permanent and long-term. The quarantines and lockdowns we've all experienced in the era of COVID-19 provide insight into the chronic anxiety undocumented immigrants suffer when attempting to plan their lives. We all know firsthand what it's like to try to make plans for the next month or the next holiday and suffer through the anxiety of not knowing if any of it would even be possible. Undocumented immigrants live with this uncertainty every day of their lives. Soon after the young reader's version of The Distance Between Us came out in the fall of 2016, Donald Trump became president and anti-immigrant sentiment reached an all-time high. Family separations also reached new heights. It had never been so clear to me how different my story is from the immigrants of today. And even now, I can't forget that when I was writing The Distance Between Us, and then its sequel, A Dream Called Home, I was doing so from a place of privilege. I am now a US citizen. I live an upper middle class life as a college graduate and a professional writer. In short, I had nothing to lose in telling my own story. The American dream that I am now enjoying could easily have turned into the American nightmare that others are enduring today. Though migration to the US has always had its perils, I know that if I were to have crossed the border today instead of in the 1980s, this book probably wouldn't even exist. The truth is that I might have faced a completely different fate than the undocumented success story I wrote about in my memoirs. And yet, I've also come to understand that had I not immigrated to the US and taken advantage of every opportunity life afforded me, I wouldn't be the writer I am today. And the thought that had circumstances been different, I might have never had books and writing in my life gives me tremendous grief. Despite the trauma I've endured before, during, and after my migration journey, despite the hoops I've had to jump through to finally be allowed to make a home here, despite the fact that I will have to keep earning my right to remain and work hard so that others see me as someone who deserves to be here, the sacrifices have been worth it. I was reminded of this when The Distance Between Us was published in Mexico in 2017. I traveled to Oaxaca to participate as a featured speaker as part of the city's annual book fair. Over the years, I've returned to Mexico every so often to visit my relatives, but this was my first time visiting my native country to participate in a book festival. This event meant so much to me. My journey since I immigrated had been long and arduous, and now I had returned to the land of my birth, feeling proud of what I had accomplished. I had transformed myself from an undocumented immigrant to a university graduate and best-selling author. It didn't take long for my visit to turn from sweet to bitter. I discovered that in Mexico, my book sells for 220 pesos, or $16, about the same price as it costs here in the US. But the minimum daily wage in Mexico, especially in poor rural areas like the city where I was born, is around 100 pesos. In other words, if Mexicans want to buy my book, it will cost them 2 days worth of wages. For poor families like mine, reading is a luxury. You either eat or you read. It is no wonder that although I had about 200 people in the audience at my event, most of them handed me a piece of paper to autograph instead of a book at the signing. After the day's events, the book fair organizers hosted the authors for a dinner at a fancy restaurant in downtown Oaxaca. We were inside eating mole negro and drinking mezcal, talking about our writing careers, the book fair panels, our current projects. Outside of the restaurant, I could see children looking through the windows and glass doors, trying to get our attention. They had trays of gum and candy they wanted to sell to us. If any of them tried to get in, the restaurant staff would quickly usher them out. That used to be me, I thought, as I watched them shaking their trays. I remember myself as a little girl back in my hometown, Iguala, carrying boxes of candy, gum, and cigarettes, hoping to sell enough to have something to eat that day. I was suddenly split in half. Half of me, the best-selling author Reyna Grande, was in that restaurant, drinking and rubbing elbows with distinguished writers. The other half of me, little Reyna, was outside, hungry and helpless, looking at that other me through the glass doors. That visit to my native country reminded me of this irrefutable fact. I wouldn't be a writer today if I had never come to the United States. As I looked around the restaurant at the writers with whom I had shared the stage and celebrated our publishing accomplishments, the thought that kept going through my head was that if things had been different, Instead of their peer, I could have been their mate. In California, I found opportunities that I didn't have in my hometown, but one small basic thing would have a tremendous impact on my life: access to a public library. In neighborhoods like the one where I was born, public libraries don't exist. With little or no access to books, there were no readers in my family, let alone writers. My maternal grandfather was illiterate. My father only made it to the 3rd grade, and my mother didn't get past 6th grade. They never developed the habit of reading or came to love books. They literally couldn't afford to. Not all readers are writers, but all writers are readers, and that was true in my case. But in my native country, I would have been neither. Luckily for me, by immigrating, books were suddenly within my reach. I was in junior high school the first time I set foot in the Arroyo Seco Public Library in Northeast Los Angeles, near my school. I quickly came to love it. I was desperate to learn English so I could get out of that ESL program I had been placed in and rid myself of the stigma of being an English language learner. Reading books, especially books on tape, now called audiobooks, is how I learned the language. Every week I stopped by the public library to check out 10 books, the maximum I was allowed to borrow. I devoured them and came back for more. Soon I wasn't reading to learn English, I was reading because I fell in love with stories, and then I began to write my own. As a low-income, formerly undocumented immigrant, English language learner, and first-generation college student, I had a long fight to become a professional writer. After all, I was trying to make a career in an industry where not many people like me exist. I had to write my way into existence. I knocked down barriers with my pen, built bridges with my words. The dream I am living now is woven with the stories I write. But the one thing I'll never forget is that my story could have been a tragedy instead of a fairy tale. Through the years, I am often confronted with the realization of how close I came to not living the life I have now. If my family and I had crossed the border in today's America instead of 1985, I would have been separated from my father when we got caught by Border Patrol, and he would have been blamed for our separation. I would have been one of the thousands of children thrown into a cage, or worse, I could have died in the crossing, which due to the border wall that was approved by the first Bush administration, then constructed in the 1990s under Clinton, and then expanded incrementally in the decades that followed, is so much more dangerous now than it was in the 80s. When I read the horror stories in the news of migrant children being found dead in the desert or washing up on the banks of the Rio Grande, I think that could have been me. That could be you, I hear teachers tell their immigrant students whenever I speak at high schools and colleges around the country. I am an undocumented success story now. I'm the candy girl who escaped from poverty, who didn't get locked up, who didn't get deported. I'm the girl living the dream. But I never forget about those who are still on the outside looking in. Thank you for reading my memoirs. Now my dream is to see more immigrant stories being read and celebrated. I want to see immigrant writers being given the opportunity to write their own stories on their own terms and being recognized for their contributions to American literature. But above all, I want all immigrants to be treated with respect and with the dignity they deserve. Maybe one day, we as a country can finally be proud to claim that our superpower is our immigrant community. Thank you.